morning. I'm Elisa Winter. Welcome. Welcome to you all and Happy New Year. We are back in the saddle again. Yay for 2023. We invite you into our spiritual community of hope, courage, and compassion. Now take a deep breath and release it as we ready our hearts and minds to enter this precious space to take in a new year and perhaps new perspectives. We light this candle to begin our services, and I encourage you all to light one of your own. Today may not be your typical expected service for January, but then our guest speaker isn't a typical kind of guy. We have a writer, musician, and cowboy, Steve Brooks, to tell us about the True West, a multicultural mythology. Steve is a speaker and a songwriter. He has performed at more than 40 UU churches around Texas and beyond. His services are entertaining and thought-provoking blends of sermon and song. Musically, he's known for writing a song a week for Jim Hightower's radio show and for songs that have been recorded by folk and American artists like Slade Cleaves, Albert and Gage, Russell Crowe, and more. He's had music in 2 films and appeared in 2 more, including the 2004 release Barbecue, a Texas Love Story. A master of words as well as music, he was featured on TV's I've Got a Secret as a 6-time world pun champion. Some of his songs, sermons, and puns can be found at stevebrooks.net. I give you Steve Brooks and our opening song.
Our opening song comes from the great Louisiana and East Texas blues singer Leadbelly. The song could be called kind of a cowboy blues. When I was a cowboy, I'd ride the western plains. When I was a cowboy, I'd ride the western plains. I'd make about $500,000 pulling on the bridle reins. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay. They say the greatest battle fought on the western plains. They say the greatest battle fought on the western plains. When me and a bunch of cowboys run into Jesse James. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay. Me and a bunch of cowboys run into Jesse James. Me and a bunch of cowboys run into Jesse James. Them bullets was a-falling just like a shower of rain. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay. Your house catch on fire, there ain't no water around. If your house catch on fire, there ain't no water around. Throw your jerry roll out the window, let the shack burn to the ground. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay. Now come on, all you cowboys, don't you want to go? Come on, all you cowboys, and don't you want to go? Had meet with the Lone Ranger on the trail of the buffalo. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay. Come a cow, cow, yicky, come a cow, cow, yicky, yicky, yay.
And now a reading called A Woman Trail Driver, written by an actual cowgirl, Amanda Burks. Over in Boski County, late one evening, a storm overtook us, and Mr. Burks drove me off into a more sheltered part of the timber. He unfastened the traces of the buggy and gave me the lines, but told me if the horses tried to run, to let them go. Hail had begun to fall by this time, and he had to hurry back to help the men hold the frightened cattle. Harder and heavier fell the hail, and rain was pouring down in torrents. The horses worked their way around to one side of the buggy seeking protection, and it seemed that it would only be a few seconds until they pulled away from me entirely. Determined not to let the horses go, I left the shelter of my buggy top and tied the horses with a rope that I always carried with me. I got back to the buggy and sat there, cold and wet and hungry and all alone in the dark. So homesick. This is the only time of all the months of my trip that I wished I was back on the old ranch at Banketay. But please don't think, now that I've finished telling the few stories of my trip over the old Kansas Trail, that my journey was one of trials and hardships. One day, Mr. Vaughn said as we were resting along the way, "In the heat of the day, when I'm riding behind my cattle, I think of you and I'm sorry for you. But when I see your smile of happiness and contentment, I know my sympathy is wasted." What Mr. Vaughn said is true. For what woman, youthful and full of spirit and the love of living, needs sympathy because of availing herself of the opportunity of being with her husband in the great out-of-door world?
Now we're going to have a song that is 100 years old, from the Texas-Mexico border, based on a true story called the ballad El Corrido de Gregorio Cortés. It was down in the county of Carnes, a great misfortune befell. Deputy sheriff was dead, a vaquero was wounded as well. Then said Gregorio Cortés, with his pistol in his hand, "It's not for the sheriff I'm sorry, but my brother's blood on the sand." Then said Los Americanos, "We know it without any doubt. If many go in to arrest him, there will be very few coming out." It was on a ranch down in Kansas. They surrounded him one and all. They were over 300. He jumped out of the corral. Then ran Los Americanos, white as the milk of a thistle, because of the fear that they had. Cortés with only his pistol. It was over in Encinal, according to what they have said. There was a flurry of bullets, another sheriff was dead. Then said Gregorio Cortez, with his pistol in his hand, it takes so many mounted rangers just to catch one Mexican. But they say it's because of me that so many people have died. It's time to give myself up, so no more mothers will cry. And so Cortez did surrender. Now his story is over, but still his poor family remembers, and every heart on the border. Good morning, everyone. Back when I was 17, for the first time in my life, I headed west. Like many a Western pilgrim, I wasn't just changing places. I was looking to change my life. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I had been bookish to the extreme. I was on my way to an experimental college that promised to develop a different side of me. Deep Springs was set on a California cattle ranch. When I wasn't sitting in class, I spent my days bucking hay bales, milking cows, driving a mule team, feeding steers, and rendering steers into steaks. I was 2 valleys over from Death Valley. I was living the cowboy way, a way which eventually brought me to Texas. The cowboy way. Who among us has not felt its fascination? In movies, stories, and songs, the archetypes of the cowboy and the frontier have shaped a set of American values. To many, they're the most American of American values. They're values of rugged individualism, of stoic and practical people who fight enormous obstacles to bring civilization to a wild frontier. It's a hard story to resist, even when we know that it has dark sides of white supremacy, patriarchy, genocide, and deportation. In recent decades, though, historians have re-examined the Old West and stripped off a lot of the whitewash. They've painted a more complex and more complete picture of a West that was less white, less individualistic, and less wild. What might this picture mean for us today? For 21st century Americans, could it offer us a more timely set of values? Could it hold lessons for Unitarian Universalists as we struggle with what multiculturalism means in practice? And for those of us who still love cowboys, could a truer West give us a richer version of the cowboy way? Let's start with the cowboy. In the myth, he is a frontier version of a medieval knight. He's a solitary figure who roams the countryside, seeking out injustices and setting them right. As presented by Hollywood, he is literally a white knight on a steed. In the historical West, however, he was often a black knight. In the generation of the great cattle drives, employment rosters show that as many as 1 out of every 4 cowboys was African American. Black cowboys go back to the early years of Texas. When southern farmers migrated to cattle country, some of their slaves learned to manage herds from the back of a horse. In the aftermath of the Civil War, those same white ranchers needed a skilled workers to round up wild longhorns and then to push them to the railheads up in Kansas. The Chisholm Trail, the I-35 of cattle drives, had been blazed by a pair of Native Americans, including the Cherokee scout John Chisholm. For free black men, that trail meant jobs, with better wages and working conditions than most of the available alternatives. It even offered a degree of equality, not in the towns where they were forced to eat and sleep in separate quarters, but on ranches and in cattle camps. Writes the historian Kenneth Wiggins, during the halcyon days of the cattle range, Negroes there frequently enjoyed greater opportunities for a dignified life than anywhere else in the United States. They worked, ate, slept, played, and on occasion fought, side by side with their white comrades. Several dozen became living legends, although their names have largely disappeared from the history books. They included characters like Bass Reeves, a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Indian Territory, who apprehended 3,000 outlaws and may have inspired the fictional character of the Lone Ranger. Bill Pickett, a rodeo Hall of Famer who created bulldogging, a technique for wrestling a steer to the ground. And Mary Fields, the first black female mail carrier, who wielded a shotgun as she drove a stagecoach across Montana. But the multicultural cowboy goes back even further. He was born on the plains of northern Mexico. Starting in 1521, cattle were imported from the grasslands of Spain, along with techniques for herding them from the saddle. Herders took on the name vaquero, from the Spanish word for cow. Most vaqueros were fully or partly indigenous, and they put their own stamps on the traditions. They introduced broad-brimmed hats and spurs. They wore leather leggings to protect their legs from thorny brush and cacti. Most important, they braided strips of rawhide and horsehair into stiff ropes that they called reatas or lazos, up to 60 feet long. They could throw one at a full gallop, especially during roundups, which they called rodeos. The name included the riding and roping contests after the day's work was done. 3 centuries later, they passed those techniques to the first Anglos in Texas. Richard King, the founder of the King Ranch, recruited 100 families from a town in northern Mexico. Their name got translated as cowboy. At mid-century, as many as a third of southwestern cowboys were Hispanic. But unlike black cowboys, their names are largely lost to history, partly due to Anglos who were out to steal their land. The exceptions were generally those who resisted, like the tenant farmer Gregorio Cortez. After being wrongly accused of horse theft, Cortez killed 2 sheriffs in self-defense. He evaded a manhunt of 300 Texas Rangers for 10 days before he turned himself in. Ballads of his exploits are still sung on both sides of the border. One of the paradoxes of cowboys is that most of them were independent contractors, but they operated in tight-knit teams, depending on one another for their very lives. A typical cattle drive coordinated 8 to 10 cowboys with well-defined jobs. For Westerners, in other words, community was as important as individualism. Indeed, from 1880 on, the Western region was more urban than the nation as a whole. Communities in the Old West started with wagon trains. A study of diaries from the Oregon Trail found that 37% made the journey in extended family clans. In another common pattern, one family member settled on the frontier and then encouraged relatives to follow. In this fashion, immigrants from Scandinavia founded whole towns on the northern plains. Still others were fleeing from persecution. The best known were the Mormons, but another significant movement was the Exodusters. They were 27,000 freed blacks who fled the South after Reconstruction. Seeing themselves as reenacting the biblical Exodus, they made their way to Kansas, a state with a history of fighting slavery. A third of them set up homesteads and stayed. In other respects, too, Westerners were less self-sufficient than they've been portrayed. They relied heavily on Uncle Sam to drive out the natives, to grant them free land, and to sell them water from massive irrigation projects. Economically, most of them depended on distant markets with unsteady prices. To get products to those markets, they had to pay railroad monopolies. As a result, farmers grew less independent and more organized. They formed cooperatives to store and sell grains, and they lobbied states to regulate railroads. In the 1890s, they formed the Populist Party, electing 4 governors and 5 U.S. senators. The Populists lasted less than a decade, partly because their platforms were co-opted by the 2 major parties. Today's Americans owe reforms like universal suffrage, public power companies, and initiatives and referendums to the interdependent farmers of the Old West. A less obvious handicap for those farmers was treating the West as though it was wild. In fact, much of it had been shaped for millennia by Native American stewards who understood the ecosystems far better than the interlopers. One central strategy was the use of fire. From the plains to the mountains, fire was used to clear land, to steer buffalo herds, to improve soil, and to promote the growth of edible and medicinal plants. Writes the indigenous historian Dina Helio-Whitaker, when the first white settlers observed the magnificent cathedral of Yosemite Valley, they described vast open meadows covered in luxuriant native grasses and flowering plants. These observers were there early enough to witness how the valley had been managed for centuries by native peoples. With techniques like controlled burns and even hand removal of young willows and cottonwoods, the growth of a thick and highly combustible understory was averted. By contrast, white settlers often managed land in unsustainable ways. In woodlands, they suppressed fires that encouraged brush to build up and erupt into the massive wildfires of recent years. On the Great Plains, sodbusters plowed up prairie grasses, whose deep roots had held the soil in place. They set the stage for the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. There's another aspect of the Old West that was less wild than we might think, and that's gun violence. It is true that outside of city limits, people widely armed themselves for protection. But visitors entering Dodge City encountered a sign that read, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Guns were regulated too in cowtowns like Deadwood, Abilene, Wichita, and Tombstone. Often, a visitor would check their gun at a sheriff's office and get a token to reclaim it when they were leaving town. The rationale was simple: to prevent the deadly convergence of alcohol and firearms when rowdy cowboys came in off the trail. And prevention seemed to work. One modern study found that the 5 largest cattle towns in Kansas averaged less than 1 homicide per year. As a newspaper wrote in Dodge City in 1878, an honest man attending to his own business doesn't require the constant companionship of a six-shooter to make him feel easy and safe. All of these stories only scratch the surface of the multicultural West. I could talk about the roles of women and of Asians, of the black cavalry known as Buffalo Soldiers, of Indian and even Hawaiian cowboys. But I hope I have made the case that, like an obsolete computer app, our mythology is due for an update. Which raises the question, what might a new mythology look like? What lessons might a truer West hold for us a century and a half later? One lesson is that the Old West is not so distant from the New West. Our ancestors on the frontier wrestled with issues that we are still wrestling with today. One of the biggest challenges, then and now, is how to balance individualism with belonging to an interdependent web. Not just one web, but several. An environmental web, living frugally in a land of scarce resources. An economic web that ties personal fortunes to the whims of remote markets, as well as to one another. A social web of competing claims, including the long dismissed claims of those who first lived here. To strengthen those webs, it takes cooperation across racial lines, class lines, and border lines. In that regard, we don't always have to reinvent the wagon wheel. We can learn from the successes and failures of cooperative movements, from populists to exodusters. Another lesson is that to learn from history, we need to fill in its blanks. In Unitarian Universalism, as in America at large, people of color have long legacies that have been forgotten or suppressed. Their stories can show us that multiculturalism is not purely a postmodern invention. In the Old West, races and cultures clashed and collaborated over centuries. Native Americans and Hispanics preceded Anglos. Blacks and Asians played important parts. Their stories also teach us that, unlike Western movies, we can't divide groups simply into good guys and bad guys. The clash of cultures was violent and tragic, but it could also be courageous and creative. Which brings us back to the cowboy. From one angle, he was an enforcer of white supremacy. From a different angle, he was more inclusive than most white Americans of his time. Culturally, he was a product of cross-pollination, of the same sorts that gave us jazz and rock and roll, Louisiana gumbo, and Texas barbecue. He continues evolving to this day. A third of working cowboys are non-white, particularly Hispanic. A third of them are now cowgirls as well. In other words, the archetype transcends John Wayne or Gary Cooper. Like other American symbols that have been co-opted by bigots, such as the flag and the Constitution, the cowboy is ripe for progressives and religious liberals to redefine and to reclaim. Working class Westerners are already doing it, especially ones who were excluded or erased from the old mythology. They're putting on black rodeos, Hispanic rodeos, Indian rodeos, women's rodeos, and gay rodeos. They're bringing the West full circle back to an era in which European Americans are not a majority. In that spirit, let us continue to integrate the best of the Old West with the new. May we reframe the cowboy as a figure of inclusion rather than racism. May we be rugged individualists who can work together in beloved communities. Above all, As we reinvent the West, may we keep it a land in which any one of us can reinvent ourselves. We can be a kid from the res or the barrio, a refugee from war and poverty overseas, or even a geeky high school graduate from back east. In the year of 2023, as it was in 1883, it's still the cowboy way. Thus endeth the presentation, and I believe the floor is open for questions and answers. One of my
Yes.
favorite parts of services.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And the floor is open for questions. If you would, I think I can see you all, but to be sure, if you would use the reaction button at the bottom and just raise your hand, and that way we can go in some order and make sure everybody gets their question asked of Steve. And so I'm looking for hands.
Hand
Unmute.
is a hand.
Yeah, Martin and Joan. Okay.
I think the word buckaroo came from vaquero. I really like Elisa's hat. That's really cool.
She's looking pretty cowgirlish today. All right, Susan, please, I see your hand. Thank you. You can put it down. Thanks for using it.
Thank you, Steve. I love the music. I love the message. I don't know if you saw me. I was madly writing down some notes that I wanted to capture for conversations going forward. I may have missed it at the very beginning, but what was your initial draw to the West? Coming from the East, very different sort of culture. What was the pull?
In a nutshell, the romance of the wide open spaces.
Mhm.
And it still is.
Nice, nice. Kate, it is wonderful to see you here. And you have a question for Steve. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, I just happened to have finished watching, I think it's 1883, which is kind of a cowboy serial. And it's way more multicultural and interesting than the old cowboy stuff we used to have. And I just wondered if you had seen it, and if so, what you thought of it.
I haven't seen it, so I'm interested in getting your reactions to it.
It's I think it's on the CBS streaming service or whatever. But anyway,
Thank you. I might check it out.
It has the black cowboys. It has the cowgirl as one of the main characters, and people going west. And it's interesting in the sense that I never thought about how recent that all is. That's that there were trains going at the same time as the wagon trains, and my great grandparents, who I knew, were alive back then. So.
Wow. That's cool.
A lot of the West was opened up for settlement by the railroads. For better and for worse. Uncle Sam would grant the right of ways and lots of territory on both sides of the tracks to the railroads, and that's where a lot of people ended up homesteading.
But also it also emphasizes sort of the multiculturalism of the various native groups, how different they were from one another.
Hey, thank you, Kate. Again, so glad to see you. Donna Glee Williams, I see your hand up for Steve.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Donna.
I wanted to ask why you think that, given that the actual years of the cattle drives were so short in American history, and there were so many other roles and adventures, why do you think the cowboy archetype became like the American archetype of all the possibilities? Why did it have so much power?
Well, I think it's partly because, well, I mean, there are multiple reasons. It's partly because it is, an archetype, as I mentioned, and yeah, we can trace it back to at least the medieval knight. The idea of a lone figure who is, traveling around, dispensing justice is not something that started with the mythology of the American West. Um, the idea of wide open spaces and independence is how Americans wanted to see themselves in those days, and how we still like to see ourselves. The
All right.
cowboy is seen as a figure who's very self-sufficient. Even though he was working for a big boss who paid him lousy wages.
Thanks.
Faye, would you unmute and ask your question?
So you mentioned there were railroads, and I was wondering, a lot of Chinese worked on the railroads. Did a lot of Chinese become cowboys, cowgirls?
The answer is, as I understand it, is no, and that's because after after American Indians, Chinese probably suffered the effects of racism more than anybody else in the Old West, especially on the West Coast. There was a lot of fear drummed up of Chinese immigrants who came over to do the grunt work, but much like anti-immigrant sentiment today, fear that they were coming to take over, and so the first laws to limit immigration were aimed at Chinese and Asians and requiring them to return back home after a few years. So for the most part, they didn't get to take part in the cattle culture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Susan and then Linda Foss.
Thanks, Mary. Steve, I did want to just ask you to maybe expand on a comment you made. It was one of the first things I wrote down, because I just feel like there's this sort of universal message, and I think a lot of it has to do with our spirituality. It really captured it for me, which is that, and your quote was, community is as important as individualism. Can you expand on that a little bit? I think people struggle to believe that if you're part of a community, you're not really in touch with yourself, or vice versa. But what are your, maybe expand on that a little bit for me, please.
Well, to me, personally, there's always a tension between obligations to a community and the desire to be part of a community, and personal ideas and personal desires that may be in conflict with that community. One of the attractions of Unitarian Universalism, has always been, the maintenance of that tension, the idea of, free thought and the power of conscience, while at the same time, getting together and trying to do things together. So I think, individualism and community are both important values. And when things get out of whack is when the pendulum swings too far to the side of one or the other.
Thanks. Good question. Thank you, Susan. Linda Foss. Yeah, you unmuted. Thank you.
We have a book that is a compendium of women's diaries of the Western movement. And my great great grandmother's diary is recorded in there. And the foreword of it says, and it is a total vanity press kind of thing where you send your family diary and they set it up and they print a bunch of them together. There's a whole series apparently, but they said, whereas many male recollections of the settling of the frontier are full of clashes with the Indians, what happened among women was slightly different. And they recorded in many instances how the Indians, in that 7th grade, I think it was, my kids read in their textbook that the settlers survived on coffee and corn and fatback. And I knew there was a whole lot more to that story. And apparently the Indian women had shown the settlers which things were, which plants were good to eat and how to prepare them. And I heard from a relative, and I'm not a very good correspondent, but he has a set of Indian grinding stones that I could just picture being left behind, sort of on the trail somewhere and picked up by a settler. But anyway, he's contributed them to the museum in the area. And I think that's a very touching artifact.
Thanks for that story.
Very cool to have that.
Yeah.
Last chance for one more question before we move along for Steve. Anybody? Hand up, literally, or this one? Okay. Well, Steve, thank you for that new perspective, for sure, on the West. I've certainly learned a lot. We are about to ask you to join us in a closing song, but we will also have closing words after the song. We want you to sing your heart out, but we want you to stay muted. And so we will close with a very familiar song. Take it away, Steve.
All right. Before we get into singing this, I'll tell you a little bit of history that you may not be familiar with, is the multicultural roots of the song Home on the Range. The song was originally written in 1874 in Kansas by a doctor named Brewster Higley. He wrote the words, and a friend of his set it to music. We know this because the words were published in a Kansas newspaper that year. However, after those words were published, the song disappeared to history for a quarter century. The words and music were not published together until 1908, when the Texas folklorist John Lomax collected the song Home on the Range from a black saloon keeper in San Antonio, who said that he had learned the song back in the 1880s when he had been up in Kansas on cattle drives. The chief difference between the version that Lomax collected and the original words was the loss of an indefinite article. In Higley's original words, the phrase was "a home on the range." As happens often in the folk music process, that phrasing was improved a little bit to the version that we know now. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Oh, seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. How often at night, when the heavens are bright with a light from the glittering stars, have I stood here amazed and asked as I gazed if their glory exceeds that of us. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day, where the air is so pure, the zephyrs so free, the breeze is so balmy and light, that I would not exchange my home on the range for all of the city so bright. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy, the skies are not cloudy, the skies are not cloudy all day.
You all sounded so beautiful. Elisa.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing your talent with us. That was really fun. Wishing you a new year full of new perspectives. Let's try and ferret out the old perspectives and get some new ones. What will you discover this year? We extinguish this candle to end our service. Go into this new year with new perspectives and peace and kindness and health and happiness and more fun than you can handle.
Amen and blessed be. Well, that ends our service, and we'll say goodbye and thank you for coming. For those of all of you that can, we will not have joys and concerns or community time today. We have a congregational meeting that will start soon, and so if you need to, we'll start at 11. Do that bio break or get some water, gear yourselves up. Woohoo! All are welcome to stay to the congregational meeting. If you have to go, we'll send you off with our love ritual. But if you could stay and join us for the meeting, we would much appreciate that. There will be some voting to be done by its members. Steve, thank you again. It was wonderful, wonderful to have you as part of our fellowship today. And we'll send you all off, but come back at 11. Don't go too far so we can have our congregational meeting. All right. Love you guys.
Happy trails.
Happy
Buckaroos and
trails.
Buckarettes.